What if the capital of the United States had burned to ashes only 14 years after it was founded? What if the dream of Washington, D.C. had ended in fire before it ever became the seat of power? Washington, D.C. is today the symbol of American power. It houses the White House, the Capitol, and the Supreme Court. It is the city where presidents rise and fall, where laws are born, and where the fate of nations is often decided. But before the grand monuments, before the marble columns, before the city was even imagined, this land had a history thousands of years deep. A history that is rarely told. A history filled with migration, conflict, trade, and survival. This is where the story begins, not in 1790 with the founding of the capital, but in the deep past, long before George Washington ever dreamed of a city on the Potomac. Long before Europeans arrived, the land that would one day become Washington, D.C. was home to indigenous peoples. Archaeological evidence shows that humans lived along the Potomac River for at least 12,000 years. Imagine hunters following herds through thick forests, stone tools in their hands, carving out a life in a land both harsh and abundant. By 1000 CE, powerful cultures had taken root here. The Nacotchtank people, sometimes written as Anacostans, lived along the eastern bank of the Anacostia River. Their villages were permanent, made of bark-covered houses. They fished in the river, hunted in the forests, and cultivated crops such as corn, beans, and squash. The name Anacostia that we use today comes directly from their people. But they were not alone. To the north, the Piscataway people held influence. To the west, smaller groups like the Doeg and Powhatan maintained ties. Trade routes ran across the Chesapeake, stretching inland and outward to other tribes. The Potomac was a superhighway of its time, carrying goods, ideas, and alliances. But here's something you might not expect. This wasn't some untouched wilderness waiting for colonizers. It was a managed, thriving landscape. Native peoples cleared fields with fire, maintained fisheries, and created trade hubs. They had already shaped the land that Europeans would later call a wilderness. By the early 1600s, Europeans were pushing into the Chesapeake region. In 1608, Captain John Smith, famous for founding Jamestown, traveled up the Potomac River. His maps recorded villages near where Washington now stands. He described the land as fertile and the river as wide and deep. But contact brought danger. Smallpox swept through native communities, devastating populations who had no immunity. By the mid-1600s, the Nacotchtank were already struggling to survive. Conflicts followed. Colonists wanted land for tobacco farming, the cash crop that fueled Virginia and Maryland's wealth. Native communities were pushed, pressured, and eventually displaced. By the late 1600s, the once powerful Nacotchtank were nearly gone, absorbed into larger groups like the Piscataway or forced westward. So when we think of D.C. as a new city created in the late 1700s, we forget the civilizations that had lived there for millennia. The capital story doesn't start with George Washington. It starts with people who were nearly erased from the record. By the 1700s, the land along the Potomac was part of two colonies, Maryland to the north and Virginia to the south. The river divided them, but it also connected them. Ships carried tobacco down the Potomac to markets in Europe. Wealthy planters built estates along the river. One of those estates would become iconic, Mount Vernon, owned by George Washington. Another, across the river, was Arlington, once home to the Custis and Lee families. These plantations represented power, but they were built on enslaved labor. By this time, enslaved Africans were a growing population in the region, working the fields, building the houses, and generating the wealth that kept the colonies running. And here's a forgotten truth. The very soil of the future capital was shaped by enslaved hands long before the city was founded. Enslaved people cleared land, farmed crops, and built the infrastructure that made the Potomac region valuable. By the mid-1700s, tensions with Britain were rising. Colonists in Virginia and Maryland were divided. Some were loyal to the crown, but many, especially wealthy planters, threw their support behind independence. George Washington himself became commander of the Continental Army. When the Revolutionary War was won in 1783, a new question arose. Where should the seat of government be located? At first, the Continental Congress met in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Annapolis. But this wandering government caused problems. In fact, the very reason Washington, D.C. exists is because Congress was once run out of town by angry soldiers.
June 1783. The Revolutionary War was over, but soldiers hadn't been paid. Hundreds of them marched into Philadelphia, where Congress was meeting, and demanded their wages. The Pennsylvania government refused to call in the militia to protect Congress, so the delegates fled the city in fear. This humiliating event shocked the nation's leaders. It proved one thing: the new United States needed a capital of its own, a place not controlled by any state, not dependent on anyone else's protection. Without that mutiny, there might never have been a Washington, D.C. When the Constitution was ratified in 1787, it gave Congress the power to establish a federal district for the government. But where? Northern states wanted it near Philadelphia. Southern states wanted it further south. The decision nearly tore apart the fragile new nation. For weeks, leaders argued, compromised, and threatened to walk away. The issue wasn't just geography, it was about power, money, and slavery. And here's the secret that most textbooks leave out. The location of the capital was tied directly to a financial deal that changed America forever. The deal came together at a private dinner hosted by Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton needed Southern support for his plan to have the federal government assume state debts from the Revolution. Southern states, especially Virginia, opposed it. But Jefferson and James Madison struck a bargain. They would back Hamilton's plan if the capital was located on the Potomac River, near Virginia. This compromise of 1790 decided two things at once: America's financial system and the location of its capital. Washington, D.C. was born not out of unity, but out of compromise and political bargaining. It was a city designed as part of a deal, not as a natural choice. President Washington himself chose the exact location for the new federal district in 1791. The land would come from both Maryland and Virginia, stretching along the Potomac River. It was 100 square miles, a perfect diamond shape. But the land was not empty. It included small towns: Georgetown in Maryland, founded in 1751, and Alexandria in Virginia, founded in 1749. Both were already thriving ports. It also included plantations, farms, and communities of free and enslaved people. The people living there had no idea that their homes were about to be swallowed by the creation of a new city that didn't yet exist. George Washington appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer who had served in the Revolutionary War, to design the new capital. L'Enfant imagined a city of grandeur, broad avenues, open squares, and monumental buildings. He wanted it to rival Paris or London. But L'Enfant's vision clashed with landowners and politicians. He demanded absolute control and refused to compromise. Eventually, he was dismissed. His plan, however, remained the foundation of the city. Yet for all his brilliance, L'Enfant died poor, buried in someone else's farm. Only later would the nation honor his role in shaping the capital. By the late 1790s, construction had begun. Workers, many of them enslaved, cleared the swampy land, built roads, and began the Capitol building and the President's house. Conditions were harsh. Malaria spread in the summer. The city was muddy, unfinished, and far from glamorous. When the government officially moved to Washington in 1800, many were disappointed. Abigail Adams, wife of President John Adams, hung laundry in the unfinished East Room of the White House. Politicians complained about the rough roads and lack of housing. By 1800, Washington was officially the nation's capital, but it was fragile. The city was unfinished, muddy, and sparsely populated. Critics mocked it as a wilderness city, a capital in name only. And then came the War of 1812, a war that brought Washington to the brink of destruction, a war that nearly erased the capital before it had a chance to stand tall. The War of 1812 didn't come out of nowhere. For years, tensions had been rising between the United States and Britain. The young nation had declared independence, but Britain never truly accepted American power. British warships harassed American trade ships. British officers boarded American vessels and forced sailors into their navy. And Britain's alliances with native nations clashed with U.S. expansion into the frontier.
The United States thought it could fight Britain to defend its honor. But in 1812, America was still a fragile republic with little money and a small, poorly trained army. And at the center of this unprepared nation sat Washington, D.C., a city that barely existed but symbolized everything America claimed to be. By 1812, Washington was still more dream than reality. The Capitol building was unfinished, with only the north wing complete. The President's house, later known as the White House, stood, but it was small compared to today's version. Streets were rough, and the city was dotted with open fields and swamps. Foreign visitors laughed at it. One traveler called Washington a city of magnificent distances because wide boulevards stretched between scattered buildings with little in between. Another called it a wilderness of bricks. And yet, in this half-built city, decisions of war and peace were made, decisions that would soon put Washington directly in Britain's crosshairs. In June 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. At first, Americans were optimistic. They thought capturing Canada, a British territory, would be easy. But the invasion failed. The U.S. Army was weak and leadership was poor. The war dragged on. British naval blockades strangled American trade. Coastal towns were raided. In Chesapeake Bay, British ships prowled freely, launching attacks on Maryland and Virginia. And yet, Washington seemed far from danger. Politicians in the capital didn't believe the British would bother attacking their unfinished city. They thought Baltimore, a wealthy port, would be the main target. That belief would prove to be a deadly mistake. By 1814, the war had turned against the United States. Napoleon's defeat in Europe freed up British troops and ships. Now Britain could focus on crushing America. The Chesapeake Bay became a staging ground for invasion. British forces led by Rear Admiral George Cockburn raided coastal towns, burned farms, and spread fear. Cockburn was ruthless, but he had a clear plan: humiliate the United States by striking at its capital. Washington wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, and symbols, when destroyed, send powerful messages. August 14th, British troops marched toward Washington. American forces scrambled to stop them at Bladensburg, just northeast of the city. It should have been a chance to defend the capital, but poor planning doomed the Americans. Troops were untrained, officers argued over strategy. The militia broke under pressure. President James Madison himself rode out to the battlefield to observe, making him the only sitting U.S. president ever to come under direct enemy fire. But the collapsed, soldiers fled in panic. The battle became known as the Bladensburg Races because of how fast the American troops ran. With the road wide open, nothing stood between the British Army and Washington, D.C. On August 24, 1814, British troops marched into the capital. Washington was almost defenseless. They headed straight for the Capitol building. Inside,
They piled up furniture and set it ablaze. Flames engulfed the chamber where Congress had met. The fire was so hot that it melted glass and caused stone to crack. Next, they marched to the president's house. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, had already fled, but before leaving, she saved a now famous portrait of George Washington. Hours later, British troops torched the building. The White House burned, its walls blackened and roof destroyed. The British then turned to other government buildings. The Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, all were set aflame. Smoke and fire lit up the night sky. Witnesses said the glow could be seen miles away, a fiery scar across the horizon. Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, was burning to the ground. The destruction was shocking. The Capitol was a ruin. The White House was gutted. Public buildings were rubble. Only the Patent Office was spared. Its superintendent convinced the British that destroying inventions would hurt all of humanity. But as devastating as the fires were, the British occupation lasted only about 26 hours. A massive storm, possibly a hurricane, swept into the city. Fierce winds and torrential rain put out the flames. Tornadoes were reported tearing through the streets. Some Americans later claimed the storm was divine intervention, that nature itself had saved the capital, but Washington remained a charred ruin. News of the burning stunned the nation. Critics mocked America for being unable to protect its own capital. Foreign observers declared the experiment of American democracy a failure. In Congress, some even argued for abandoning Washington entirely and moving the capital back to Philadelphia or another city. Why rebuild a place so vulnerable and so poorly defended? This was the first true survival test for Washington, D.C. Would the dream of a federal city die in the ashes of 1814, or would it rise again? Rebuilding was slow and painful. Funds were scarce. The government debated whether it was worth it. But leaders like President James Madison and architect Charles Benjamin Henry Latrobe pushed forward. They saw the Capitol not just as buildings, but as the very symbol of national unity. Work began to restore the Capitol and the White House. Enslaved labor was used again, laying bricks, cutting stone, and rebuilding walls. By the late 1810s, the core of the city was rising from the ruins. Out of destruction came determination. The burning of Washington, instead of ending the Capitol, gave it new meaning. The city became a symbol of resilience. The War of 1812 ended in 1815 with the Treaty of Ghent. Neither side gained territory, but America claimed victory and survival. The burning of Washington became a rallying point, a memory of loss and renewal. Foreign nations realized the U.S. Capitol could not be erased so easily, and Americans, embarrassed but defiant, took pride in rebuilding. What if the capital of the United States had remained little more than a swamp, mocked and ignored by the very leaders it was meant to inspire? What if, instead of becoming the power center of the world, Washington, D.C. had collapsed under disease, division, and neglect? After the War of 1812, Washington stood scarred but alive. Its public buildings were burned shells, its streets were muddy tracks, and its population was shrinking. Many Americans wanted to abandon the city entirely. But the dream of a permanent federal capital was too important to let die. Slowly, painfully, Washington was rebuilt. Yet the city's survival wasn't guaranteed. For decades, it would struggle, ravaged by poverty, disease, sectional conflict, and political ridicule. This is the story of how Washington, D.C. staggered through the first half of the 19th century, clinging to life until the Civil War forced it into its true role as the capital of a divided nation. The burning of 1814 had left the Capitol, the White House, and much of Washington in ruins. Rebuilding began almost immediately, led by architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe and later Charles Bulfinch. The Capitol's dome, still a low wooden structure at this time, was restored. The White House was gutted and rebuilt with stronger walls. New government offices rose from the ashes. But it was slow. Money was tight. The federal government operated on small budgets, and the city was low on Congress's list of priorities. In fact, Washington was so neglected that for years the government literally rented space in boarding houses for congressional offices. Imagine the nation's lawmakers squeezed into taverns and rented rooms, conducting business in buildings that looked like roadside inns. Through the 1820s and 1830s, Washington was more village than city. Its population hovered between 20,000 and 30,000, tiny compared to bustling cities like New York, Philadelphia, or Boston. The streets were poorly maintained, dust choked the air in summer, and mud swallowed carriages in winter. Cows grazed openly on the mall, which was little more than pasture land. Georgetown, still an independent town, was more prosperous than Washington itself. Foreign visitors ridiculed the capital. Charles Dickens called it the city of magnificent intentions, mocking its wide boulevards lined with empty fields. Alexis de Tocqueville observed in the 1830s that Washington seemed without past, without present, without future. For many, Washington was a joke. Yet beneath the ridicule, the city held seeds of transformation, seeds planted by politics, by slavery, and by sectional conflict. Washington was built to represent democracy, but it was also a slave city. Enslaved people labored in homes, hotels, and on the streets. They were hired out by masters to work in construction and service jobs. Without them, Washington could not function. At the same time, Washington had a growing free black population. By the 1830s, thousands of free black residents lived in the city, working as craftsmen, teachers, and business owners. They created churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. But this fragile balance of freedom and bondage made Washington a microcosm of the national struggle, a city of contradictions, caught between liberty and slavery. Despite its small size, Washington was the stage where America's most dramatic political battles played out. Congress debated tariffs, banking, and expansion. Presidents came and went. Political parties rose and collapsed. In 1829, Andrew Jackson swept into Washington as president, bringing with him crowds of ordinary supporters. At his inauguration, people stormed the White House, breaking furniture and spilling punch on the carpets. Critics called it the reign of King Mob. Washington had been designed as a city for order and grandeur. But what happened in Jackson's presidency revealed just how chaotic and unruly democracy could be. Life in Washington was harsh. Malaria and yellow fever swept through the swamps each summer. Cholera outbreaks in the 1830s and 1840s killed hundreds. Poor sanitation turned parts of the city into health hazards. The city lacked clean water until the mid-19th century, when the Washington Aqueduct was built. Before that, wells and pumps served the population, often contaminated. In a city meant to symbolize the promise of the Republic, many residents lived in misery, struggling with poverty, illness, and decaying infrastructure. Amid the decay, Washington slowly developed symbols of national pride. In 1848, construction began on the Washington Monument, a towering obelisk to honor the first president. Work was slow and plagued with funding issues, but its foundation marked a turning point. The Smithsonian Institution was established in 1846, funded by an Englishman's donation to the United States. Its first building, the red sandstone castle, rose on the Mall. These projects hinted at the city's potential. They were the first signs that Washington might one day be more than mud and mockery. By the 1840s, Washington had become a flashpoint in the national debate over slavery and expansion. The city was home to one of the largest slave markets in America, located just blocks from the capital.
Men, women, and children were bought and sold in sight of the Dome of Congress. Abolitionists were outraged. They flooded Congress with petitions to end slavery in the Capitol. Pro-slavery politicians fought back, imposing a gag rule to silence debate. Washington embodied the contradiction of America itself, proclaiming liberty while enslaving people in the shadow of its most sacred institutions. The sectional crisis reached Washington directly in 1850. As part of the Compromise of 1850, Congress abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia, though slavery itself remained legal. This compromise was seen as a victory by abolitionists, but it was partial. Enslaved people were still held in Washington until the Civil War. Yet the end of the slave trade in the Capitol was symbolic. It exposed the deep cracks in the nation. Those cracks were widening fast, and Washington would soon be the epicenter of a national fracture that threatened to destroy the Union itself. Washington in the 1830s, 1850s was not just a place of politics. It was a place of violence. Riots broke out between nativists and immigrants, between pro-slavery mobs and abolitionists, between different factions of workers. The city was lawless in parts. Taverns and gambling houses flourished. Congressmen themselves sometimes brawled. In 1856, Representative Preston Brooks brutally beat Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, a shocking moment that showed how far division had gone. Washington wasn't just the stage for politics, it was becoming the front line of America's unraveling. By the late 1850s, the United States was tearing apart over slavery and expansion. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 pushed Southern states to secede. Washington suddenly sat on the border between North and South, surrounded by slave states, Maryland and Virginia. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Washington became a vulnerable outpost, barely defended and at risk of attack. The capital of the Union was almost encircled by Confederate territory. What does it mean for a city to live under siege, not just from armies, but from the weight of history itself? Washington, D.C. in the 1860s was not yet the monumental capital of marble we imagine today. It was fragile, uneven, half-formed, and divided by the very crisis that threatened to tear the Union apart. Yet within 4 bloody years, this uncertain capital would transform into the heart of America's survival, a fortress bristling with cannons, hospitals overflowing with the wounded, and streets alive with the footsteps of freed slaves who saw the city as both sanctuary and symbol. Washington was never guaranteed to survive the Civil War at all. In fact, there were moments when Confederate armies stood within striking distance of its unprotected core, when the White House itself seemed only days away from enemy hands. This is the story of Washington, D.C. at war, how it was fortified, tested, nearly broken, and reborn. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office in March of 1861, Washington was barely more than a small town pretending to be a capital. It had fewer than 80,000 residents, many of them transient government clerks, tradesmen, or enslaved people serving the city's elite. Streets were still half mud, half gravel. Construction sites stood abandoned. And to the south, across the Potomac, Virginia had already begun to drift towards secession.
Lincoln's arrival itself was marked by secrecy and tension. Rumors of assassination swirled, and the president-elect had been smuggled into Washington under guard, arriving in the dead of night. His presence symbolized both hope and fragility, a new leader in a city that might collapse before his term had even begun. Within weeks of Fort Sumter's bombardment in April 1861, the streets of Washington echoed with drums and marching boots. Union troops poured into the Capitol, bivouacking in fields, public buildings, and even the unfinished Capitol Dome. The city, designed to represent stability, became a military camp overnight. The real crisis came when Virginia seceded. Overnight, Washington found itself perched on the very border of enemy territory.
The Confederate state lay just across the Potomac River, its hills offering a commanding view of the capital. Union leaders knew the city could not survive without immediate defenses. On May 24, 1861, Union troops crossed the river into Alexandria to secure the high ground. The move cost the life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, a friend of Lincoln, who was shot while tearing down a Confederate flag. His death became one of the first martyrs of the war and a chilling reminder. Washington's enemies were now just a few miles away. The capital was suddenly a city in the crosshairs. To lose it would mean not only strategic disaster, but also symbolic collapse. How could the Union claim legitimacy if its very capital fell? Almost overnight, Washington became the most heavily fortified city in the Western Hemisphere. Engineers, soldiers, and laborers, many of them escaped enslaved people, later known as contrabands, worked tirelessly to construct a massive ring of defenses. By 1865, the city was encircled by 68 forts, 93 batteries, and nearly 20 miles of trenches and military roads. Earthworks rose from the hills, cannons pointed in every direction, and picket lines stretched deep into Maryland and Virginia. Every approach into Washington bristled with armed checkpoints. Civilians had to carry passes, wagons were searched. The Potomac, once a serene river, was now patrolled by gunboats. The once open city became a garrison, its survival dependent on the bayonets of thousands. Yet this militarization came at a cost. Housing shortages soared as soldiers flooded the city. Crime spiked. Saloons multiplied. Disease followed the armies. Measles, dysentery, and smallpox sweeping through camps and hospitals. The capital was no longer just the seat of government. It was the beating, chaotic heart of a nation at war with itself. War transformed Washington into a vast hospital. Public buildings, churches, schools, and warehouses were converted into wards. The patent office, normally a monument to invention, became lined with rows of sickbeds. Tents sprawled across open fields, filled with wounded from battlefields like Antietam and Gettysburg. Soldiers missing limbs, coughing from infections, or racked with fevers lay by the thousands. The stench of blood and carbolic acid mingled in the air. Into this world stepped Clara Barton, who began her legendary service as a nurse in Washington before following the armies to the front. Dorothea Dix organized women to serve as nurses, breaking traditional roles. Even the White House itself was touched. Mary Todd Lincoln visited the wounded, and Lincoln himself was known to stop and speak with soldiers, offering words of comfort in the midst of despair. But here's a detail often forgotten. Washington's hospitals weren't just for Union soldiers. Escaped slaves, men, women, and children who fled into the city often found refuge in these same institutions, though in segregated conditions. For them, Washington symbolized something even larger: freedom itself. As Union armies advanced into the South, enslaved people fled to Union lines in massive numbers. Thousands made their way to Washington, seeking sanctuary in the shadow of the Capitol. The city's population surged as contraband camps sprang up around its edges. Some of these settlements were overcrowded and plagued by disease, but they were also places of rebirth. Schools were established, churches formed. Formerly enslaved men found work building fortifications or serving in the military. The most famous of these new communities was Freedmen's Village, established in 1863 on the Arlington Estate, land confiscated from Confederate General Robert E. Lee. What had once been Lee's home became a settlement for hundreds of freedmen, complete with housing, farms, schools, and workshops. It was a striking symbol. The seat of a Confederate general turned into a sanctuary for freedom.
This influx of black residents reshaped Washington permanently. By the end of the war, nearly one-third of the city's population was African American, laying the foundation for the city's role as a center of black culture and politics in the decades to come. Despite its fortifications, Washington faced real and terrifying threats. Confederate leaders knew the symbolic value of the city. Raids and campaigns were designed not just to win battles, but to threaten the Union's heart. In September 1862, after the Confederate victory at Second Bull Run, Robert E. Lee marched his army into Maryland, aiming to pressure Washington and perhaps bring European recognition to the Confederacy. The resulting Battle of Antietam, America's bloodiest single day, ended the invasion but left Washington shaken. The most dramatic moment came in July 1864, when Confederate General Jubal Early led 15,000 men within sight of the Capitol dome. Panic gripped the city. Government clerks were issued muskets. Lincoln himself rode to Fort Stevens, standing in view of enemy fire, the only time in history a sitting U.S. president came under direct combat. Union reinforcements rushed in, and Early's attack was repelled. But the message was clear. Washington, for all its defenses, was never fully safe. At the center of this drama stood Abraham Lincoln. His presence in the city defined it. Tall, gaunt, and constantly weary, he walked the muddy streets, visited the hospitals, and spent sleepless nights in the telegraph office reading battlefield reports. Lincoln understood the symbolic weight of Washington. If the Capitol fell, so might the Union cause. He pressed for its defense, but he also turned it into a beacon. Here, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, transforming the war into a fight not just for Union, but for freedom. Washington became the testing ground of emancipation. In April 1862, months before Lincoln's proclamation, Congress abolished slavery in the district itself, offering compensation to loyal slaveholders. The city became the first place in America where the federal government formally ended slavery. The symbolism could not have been stronger. Yet, Lincoln's Washington was also a place of tension. Draft riots, political intrigue, and partisan newspapers filled the streets with arguments. The war was not only fought in the fields, but in the taverns, offices, and parlors of the Capitol itself. War brought grief to Washington daily. Funeral processions wound through its avenues, mourning both common soldiers and great generals. Cemeteries expanded. Arlington National Cemetery was born from this necessity, its first burials made in the front yard of Robert E. Lee's former mansion. But Washington also witnessed triumph. When news of Union victories arrived, crowds gathered outside the White House, cheering Lincoln as he spoke from the balcony. The city became the stage for the war's emotional highs and devastating lows. Then came April 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Washington erupted in celebration, bonfires blazing, bands playing, people dancing in the streets. It seemed the city had survived the war. But within days, tragedy struck. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater, just blocks from the White House. The city plunged into mourning once more. Its greatest defender struck down at the moment of victory. The funeral train that carried Lincoln's body began its journey from Washington, binding the Capitol forever to the memory of sacrifice and survival. How does a capital city heal after war? How does it rise from the smoke of battlefields, from the echoes of funeral drums, from the weight of a fallen president? Washington, D.C. in 1865 stood at a crossroads. It had survived invasion, assassination, and the greatest internal conflict in American history. Yet in many ways, its survival left it more fragile than secure. The Civil War had doubled its size, filled its streets with soldiers, freedmen, politicians, and profiteers. But what came next was an even greater challenge, building a capital worthy of the Union it claimed to represent. Would Washington sink back into its swampy mediocrity, or would it become the shining center of a modern republic? This chapter tells the story of Washington's rebirth in the Age of Reconstruction and its transformation during the Gilded Age, a tale of ambition, corruption, innovation, and identity. The war ended in April 1865, but Washington was not celebrating for long. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln shook the city to its core. His funeral cortege passed through its avenues in a somber march that drew tens of thousands, a stark reminder that victory carried scars. The Capitol had expanded beyond recognition during the war. The population swelled from under 80,000 to well over 130,000. Refugees, freedmen, veterans, and migrants had made Washington their home. But this rapid growth created chaos. Housing was scarce. Streets were clogged with carts, wagons, and livestock. Sanitation was poor. Disease festered in overcrowded quarters. Washington faced the same question as the nation: how to rebuild, how to reconcile, how to move forward. Reconstruction in Washington was not just about rebuilding, it was about identity. In 1862, the District of Columbia had been the first place in the country where slavery was officially abolished by federal law. By the war's end, thousands of freed people had made the capital their home. Freedmen's Village in Arlington continued to thrive, though overcrowded, as did smaller settlements around the city. Churches multiplied, schools were founded, and institutions like Howard University, established in 1867, emerged as beacons of education and advancement for Black Americans. But progress came with resistance. Segregation tightened its grip on public life. Freedmen who had fought to build Washington during the war now faced discrimination, poverty, and political exclusion. Washington embodied both the hope of emancipation and the harsh reality of America's racial divide. The federal government tried to impose order. New municipal systems were debated. Congress flexed its authority, sometimes treating the district less as a city and more as a federal experiment. Washington's citizens, who lacked full voting rights, often felt they were pawns in larger national struggles. Still, the city was becoming something new, not just a government seat, but a symbol of Reconstruction itself. By the 1870s, Washington was a city in transition, and one man stepped forward to shape it: Alexander "Boss" Shepard. Shepard was a native Washingtonian, a businessman, and a master of political maneuvering. In 1871, Congress created a new territorial government for the district, and Shepard became vice chair of its Board of Public Works. Soon, he was effectively running the city. He had a vision. Washington would no longer be a swampy embarrassment. He launched an ambitious program to pave roads, install sewers, build sidewalks, and plant trees. Under his leadership, the city's infrastructure exploded. In just a few years, more than 150 miles of streets were paved, hundreds of miles of sidewalks and gutters laid, and gas and water lines extended across the district. Shepard's modernization came at staggering cost. His projects nearly bankrupted the city. He spent recklessly, rewarded friends, and crushed opponents. Critics accused him of corruption and tyranny, dubbing him the Boss Tweed of Washington. By 1874, Congress lost patience. It dissolved the territorial government and placed Washington under direct federal control, governed by a three-man commission. Shepard fled to Mexico in disgrace. Yet, his legacy endured. For all his faults, Shepard gave Washington its first real bones as a modern city. Without his vision, the capital might have remained a muddy afterthought. The Gilded Age made Washington a city of contradictions. On one side, opulence, new neighborhoods like DuPont Circle and Logan Circle, filled with elegant row houses, mansions, and foreign legations. Senators and industrial barons built townhouses to display wealth. Theaters, hotels, and restaurants blossomed. On the other side, poverty. Alleys behind grand avenues filled with ramshackle dwellings. Freedmen and poor laborers crowded into substandard housing, often lacking plumbing or sanitation. Tuberculosis and typhoid spread. For every ornate parlor on Massachusetts Avenue, there was a squalid alley home just blocks away. These contradictions were not hidden. Writers, reformers, and journalists documented them. Washington became a mirror of the nation's extremes: wealth and power set against poverty and exclusion. As the nation looked to heal after the Civil War, Washington became the natural stage for memory. The city's monuments began to rise. The most ambitious was the Washington Monument, long stalled by funding shortages and political disputes. Construction had begun in 1848, but halted in the 50s. After the war, efforts revived. By the 1880s, the towering obelisk finally neared completion, symbolizing not just George Washington, but the reborn Union. Cemeteries also shaped the city's landscape. Arlington National Cemetery grew from its wartime origins into a sacred ground. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills, visible reminders of sacrifice. Memorial Day, born in the aftermath of war, became a central ritual in the capital. Washington was transforming into the keeper of national memory. Its streets and monuments told a story of unity, loss, and resilience.
The Gilded Age was an age of government growth, and Washington swelled with clerks, offices, and bureaucracy. The federal workforce multiplied. Departments of War, Treasury, State, and newly formed agencies filled rented buildings across the city. By the 1880s, massive structures like the State, War, and Navy Building, today the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, loomed near the White House, embodying the permanence of federal power. This growth shaped the city's economy. Boarding houses catered to clerks. Tailors, printers, and shopkeepers thrived on government contracts. The rhythms of Washington became tied to bureaucratic life, mundane yet vital. At the same time, Congress controlled the city's budget and governance. Washingtonians remained disenfranchised, lacking full democratic rights. The capital grew in power, but remained paradoxically voiceless. Despite obstacles, African Americans made Washington a center of culture and progress in the Reconstruction and Gilded Age era. Freedmen built communities in Shaw, U Street, and Anacostia. Black churches became hubs of organization and resilience. Howard University emerged as a premier institution, training teachers, ministers, and professionals. The city also became home to Frederick Douglass, who purchased a home in Anacostia in 1877. Douglass's presence turned Washington into a beacon of African American leadership. Black Washingtonians built businesses, published newspapers, and advocated for civil rights. But they faced segregation, limited employment, and recurring violence. Washington was both opportunity and oppression, freedom and frustration. The city's black community was forging an identity that would influence the nation for generations. By the late 19th century, Washington was becoming more recognizable as a true capital. Gaslights lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Streetcars clattered through the city, connecting neighborhoods. The population surpassed 200,000. Visitors described the city as both magnificent and maddening. They saw marble government buildings alongside muddy alleys. They encountered senators in gilded parlors and barefoot children in the streets. They heard symphonies in grand theaters while workers toiled in sweatshops nearby. The contradictions fascinated outsiders. Washington was not New York or Philadelphia. It was not a city of industry or commerce. It was a city of politics, memory, and symbolism, and in that role, it was becoming indispensable. The Gilded Age was notorious for corruption, and Washington was no exception. Patronage fueled the federal bureaucracy. Scandals erupted in Congress. Lobbyists haunted the city's hotels and saloons. Yet reform movements grew. Journalists exposed graft. Civil service reformers pushed for merit over patronage, culminating in the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Washington became the testing ground for these reforms, as thousands of federal employees shifted from political appointments to professional careers. The transformation gave the capital a more stable foundation, less vulnerable to swings of partisan politics. As the United States expanded its reach abroad in the late 19th century, Washington began to reflect its global role. Foreign embassies multiplied. International visitors passed through its avenues. The city's architecture took on grandeur meant to rival European capitals. World's fairs and expositions often bypassed Washington in favor of industrial cities, but Washington held something greater: the presence of national power. Its monuments and avenues were intended not for trade, but for symbolism. The Gilded Age marked the beginning of Washington as a stage, not just for domestic memory, but for international presence. By the dawn of the 20th century, Washington was no longer the swamp town of the early republic, nor the muddy garrison of the Civil War. It was a city of contradictions: wealth and poverty, hope and exclusion, corruption and reform. It was also a city of resilience. Reconstruction had tested its spirit. The Gilded Age had remade its bones. The capital had grown into a place that embodied the triumphs and failings of the nation it represented. The Washington that entered the 20th century was imperfect, divided, and unfinished, but it was no longer fragile. It had become undeniably the political heart of the United States. So the next time you walk the shaded avenues of DuPont Circle, or stand beneath the soaring obelisk of the Washington Monument, remember this: these stones and streets were laid in an age of ambition and contradiction. They were born of Reconstruction's promises and Gilded Age struggles. Washington was not simply built, it was contested, reshaped, and reborn. And its next chapter would test whether the capital of democracy could itself live up to democratic ideals.